The year was 1945. World War II had finally ended, bringing relief to millions across Europe. The guns had fallen silent, the concentration camps were liberated, and the world was eager to rebuild from the ruins of a deadly war. But for hundreds of thousands of people, Soviet prisoners of war, refugees, and anti-communist fighters, this was not the end of their suffering. Little did they know it was only the beginning.
Welcome to the Unveiled History.
Among the many operations conducted in the aftermath of World War II, one remains buried under the weight of history. Operation Keelhaul. It was a forced repatriation effort that condemned countless men, women, and even children to unimaginable horrors under brutal dictator Joseph Stalin. What was intended as an orderly return of Soviet citizens to their homeland became, in reality, one of the greatest betrayals by the Western Allies, a testament to the cruel nature of the post-war era. These are people who had fled Stalin's regime, some because they had been captured as prisoners of war, others because they had chosen to resist communism. Many had lived outside the Soviet Union for years, seeking freedom from oppression, but under Operation Keelhaul, they were handed back to one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century, a bloodthirsty Joseph Stalin. The decision to conduct Operation Keelhaul came from agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. There, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union decided the fate of millions. Under Stalin's demand, it was agreed that all Soviet citizens in Western-controlled territories, including those who had fought against the Soviet regime, would be forcibly repatriated. This decision was presented as a legal obligation, justified under the claim that these people were Soviet citizens. But the reality was far more bizarre. Many of these individuals were not real Soviet citizens. Some had been born in territories forcibly taken over by the USSR, such as parts of Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Others had been captured by the Germans as prisoners of war, labelled as traitors by Stalin simply because they were taken alive. Many had actively fought against the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War decades earlier and had built new lives abroad. But none of this mattered. Under Stalin's orders, anyone considered a Soviet citizen was to be returned, whether they wanted to or not. The Western Allies, particularly Britain and the United States, found themselves in a moral and political dilemma. On one hand, they had just fought a war against totalitarianism, defending freedom against the evils of Nazi Germany. On the other hand, they were now expected to betray thousands of people, many of whom had been allies or had fought against the Nazis themselves. And still, under pressure from Stalin and eager to maintain post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union, the British and American governments were forced to comply. The process of repatriation began immediately after Germany's surrender in May 1945. Across Europe, in places like Austria and Italy, thousands of refugees, prisoners of war, and displaced persons were rounded up. They were told they were being moved to new homes, given promises of fair treatment, or outright lied to about their fates. Many trusted the Western authorities, believing that they would be given a chance to choose whether to return. But as they were herded onto trains and trucks bound for Soviet-controlled territories, the reality suddenly became clear. Some resisted, only to be pummeled into submission. Others took more drastic measures. Suicides became tragically common. Knowing what awaited them in the Soviet Union, people threw themselves onto train wheels, jumped off bridges, or took their own lives in any way they could. Parents killed their own children, rather than see them fall into Stalin's hands. The stench of death filled the air. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in Linz, Austria, in May 1945. Thousands of Cossacks and their families, who had fought against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War and later against the Soviets in World War II, had surrendered to the British. These were not Soviet citizens, and many had lived in exile for decades. They believed that the British, as their wartime allies, would protect them. Instead, on orders from higher command, British soldiers tricked them into boarding trains and trucks, telling them they were being taken to a new location for resettlement. But as soon as they arrived in the Soviet-controlled zones, the deception became clear. Soviet secret police, the NKVD, were waiting for them. The horror that followed was beyond description. Men were separated from their families, beaten and executed on the spot. Women and children were sent to the Soviet Union, where many ended up in gulags, brutal forced labour camps where death was surely certain. The betrayal of the Cossacks at Linz remains one of the darkest chapters of Operation Keelhaul. The killings were done on such a scale that the estimated daily death toll stood between 3,000 to 10,000 deaths daily, with many subjected to near-death torture and forced labour. Tens of thousands of ladies were raped, and if they were resistant, they were killed. Families were torn apart and separated from each other up until this day. There were cases of entire families being wiped out in mere hours or days. Young Soviet soldiers used the operation as a form of shooting practice, finding joy and amusement in sticking their bayonets on the hearts of their victims, while others used it as a form of revenge for the Soviet Civil War. But the suffering did not end there. Across Germany and Austria, similar scenes played out. Entire families were loaded onto trains headed for the Soviet Union, known that at best they would face imprisonment and hard labour. At worst, they would be executed as traitors. And yet, the Western authorities continued to justify their actions. They argued that they were merely following agreements, that the people being handed over were Soviet citizens, and that it was not their responsibility to interfere in another country's internal affairs. But behind closed doors, many of them knew the truth. American and British soldiers who participated in these operations were often horrified by what they witnessed. Some officers refused to carry out orders, protesting that what they were doing was a violation of human rights. A few brave individuals even helped some refugees escape, forging documents or allowing them to slip away before being handed over. But these were the exceptions. The vast majority were forced to comply. By 1947, Operation Keelhaul had forcibly repatriated hundreds of thousands of people to the Soviet Union. The exact numbers remain uncertain, but estimates range between 1.5 to 2 million individuals. Some survived, many did not. Those who were sent to the Gulag system endured starvation, hard labour, and brutal treatment for years. Others were executed immediately upon arrival. The fate of many remains unknown to this day. And yet, for decades, this operation was kept in secrecy. Western governments did not want to admit their role in handing over innocent people to a regime known for its brutality. The documents detailing Operation Keelhaul were classified, and only in later years did historians begin to uncover the full extent of what happened. Operation Keelhaul is a stark reminder of how political power play can override basic human rights. The Western allies, who had fought to free Europe from Nazi tyranny, found themselves complicit in an atrocity of their own, one that condemned thousands to death and suffering. To this day, many of the victims remain unnamed, their stories lost to history, but their suffering should never be forgotten. It is a lesson in the cost of appeasement, the dangers of political compromise, and the responsibility of those in power to stand against injustice, no matter the circumstances. Operation Keelhaul was not just a military operation, it was betrayal, a crime, and one of the darkest stains on the legacy of the Second World War.